Trump sat in his office, gazing at the Manhattan skyline. In recent years, as a former president and a successful businessman, he had grown used to being in the spotlight, always in control, always knowing exactly what he wanted. But today was different. A strange anxiety gnawed at him, and he couldn't understand why. Suddenly, the phone on his desk rang. Without looking at the screen, he picked it up. "Yes?" "Donald, it's me, Fred." It felt like a bolt of lightning struck his mind. He couldn't believe it. Fred? His father, who had passed away nearly 20 years ago. For years, Trump had tried to forget everything connected to his childhood, and now, in a moment of complete calm, that memory came flooding back. "You heard me right, Donald. I know you could never forget me leaving, but believe me, you can't escape what was instilled in you from childhood. You are just like me." The voice was exactly as he remembered it, stern, commanding, confident, the same tone his father had once used to run their lives. Donald felt a tightness in his chest. Why wouldn't this feeling go away? When the call ended, a storm of memories began to rage in his mind. He remembered moments from his childhood, back when he was just a boy. He recalled his father's strict looks, the constant pressure to prove his worth. When Donald was only 10, his father, Fred Trump, was already a powerful businessman. From the very beginning of his career, Fred raised his son by strict rules. He taught him to be strong, to never show weakness, and to always pursue his goals relentlessly. Every win at family gatherings felt like a battle, and every loss a personal failure. For Donald, the hardest part was trying to live up to the expectations of a father who always seemed distant and unapproachable. When Donald was 12, his father gave him a defining challenge. It was a moment he would never forget. Fred decided his son needed to be tested to see how prepared he was for the real world. He sent Donald to a summer camp, assuring him it would be good for his development. But the camp was harsh. It was a place of raw reality, where kids from all walks of life clashed. Donald wasn't ready for life among children who didn't respect him, who called him rich boy, and mocked his manners and privilege. For the first time, Trump realized that all the money and status in the world meant nothing without real human connection and inner strength. He remembered one particular day. An older boy named Jimmy pushed him into the mud while the others laughed. Donald tried to stand up, but the teasing only grew worse. It was humiliating, and he felt like he couldn't take it anymore. He understood then that he wouldn't always be protected by the walls of wealth and influence. Reliving those memories, Donald realized that his whole life had been a struggle for approval. He saw that he had sought power, not just for himself, but to prove to his father that he was worthy. It had always been a test stone he could never truly pass, because his father remained a distant ideal. Weeks after that strange phone call, Donald made a decision. He would return to that very same camp to confront his fears and face what remained unresolved in his life. Standing once again on the campgrounds, Trump felt a wave of memories crash over him. The landscape looked the same as it did in his youth, but now everything felt different. He stood on the very spot where he had once been pushed into the mud. He remembered every detail, every painful moment. But now, he was no longer a boy. He was a grown man who had overcome countless obstacles. Returning to the camp became a moment of profound personal revelation for Trump. He realized that for all these years he had chased victory out of fear of not being good enough, of not living up to his father's standards. He had never forgiven himself for the moments of weakness he once showed. In that moment, he made a choice now to keep trying to be the man his father demanded he become. He was ready to forgive himself for his past mistakes and failures. Everything that had happened in his life no longer held the same weight. He no longer wanted to be part of the system his father had built. Trump returned to New York, but his life had changed. He no longer sought to satisfy his past. He was ready to open himself to new possibilities, free from the shadow of what was lost in childhood. Over the following weeks, Donald Trump couldn't shake the thought of the phone call he had received from his father. It was an event that completely changed his perception of his own life. A vague sense of anxiety overwhelmed him, and he couldn't find peace. He tried to come up with a logical explanation, but his thoughts kept returning to his childhood, to the time when his father was still alive, when they were locked in an invisible battle for attention and approval. Trump kept diving deeper into his memories. Again and again, he tried to recall the day that had become a turning point in his life, the moment when he first truly felt weak. It was the day his father Fred gave him a lesson that was, in essence, a punishment, though Trump hadn't understood its meaning back then. Donald remembered how, at the age of 15, he had seriously failed a high school exam for the first time in his life. He had felt confident his early ventures into business were going well, and he was managing his schoolwork despite his father's disapproval of some of his decisions. But when the exam results came back with a failing grade, his father was disappointed. He sat Donald down for a long conversation, during which he delivered a simple truth: success is only possible through hard work and effort. Trump remembered his father's words. You don't just need to be a good person, you need to be a person the whole world respects. Trump had always believed that those words gave him the motivation to push forward, no matter the difficulties. He learned to hide his emotions, never showing weakness. But now, in his mature years, those words began to take on a new meaning. He began to wonder whether everything he had achieved was driven by an unconscious desire to please his father, to prove that he was worthy of respect. Maybe all this time he had been trying to meet his father's expectations instead of following his own ideas and goals. One day, Trump decided to visit a place deeply connected to his childhood memories, the old house where his family had lived before he left for college. That house was a symbol of his youth, of the years spent trying to please his father and live up to his ambitions. When Trump arrived, he stood in front of the door, holding an old photograph. The whole scene felt surreal. The place looked just as it did in his youth, but it no longer carried the sense of belonging it once had. He wasn't coming here as a son anymore, but as a man who had spent years battling doubt and searching for meaning. And now, he finally understood that he didn't need to look to others for justification for his actions. He climbed the steps and entered the house. Everything was as he remembered it: the familiar walls, the dark hallways, the old photographs on the walls. He looked around and stopped at one photo that captured a moment from his childhood, he and his father standing next to a car, both smiling and confident. Trump couldn't help but recall how often he had tried to find that same confidence within himself, the one he saw in his father. But now, looking at that photo, he realized that his father wasn't just a role model, he had also been a source of insecurity and fear. That was what Trump feared most: the fear of being rejected, the fear of not living up to expectations. He walked over to the old chair where his father had often sat, and in that moment something inside him shifted. He understood that he didn't need to be like his father. He no longer had to conform to someone else's standards. Turning away from the chair, Donald felt that his life had finally taken a new direction. He no longer sought validation from others, no longer aimed to become someone he was trained to be. He was ready to stop being the person others had shaped him into. That was what truly mattered to him. A few days later, back in New York, Trump began to see everything in his life through a new lens. He decided to hold a series of meetings with people he had previously avoided, those who perhaps hadn't supported him, but who could offer a different perspective on the world. He began to listen to what others had to say, rather than relying solely on his gut instincts. He took responsibility for many of his past decisions and mistakes. He understood that true growth didn't come from chasing some ideal, but from accepting reality as it is. Donald Trump stood on the balcony of his luxurious apartment in New York, looking out over the city that never sleeps. He was successful, globally known, but something inside him wouldn't let go. All these years playing the game of power that had drawn him further away from his own feelings and memories, he felt as though he was trapped in a cage of his own making. He picked up the phone and called his old friend Edward Blake, a financial consultant he'd worked with for many years. "Ed, I need to talk. It's not about business, it's not about politics, it's not something external, it's me. I feel like I need to figure myself out before I keep moving forward." Ed, always confident and a little sarcastic, simply replied, "Donald, you never asked for help. Is this something serious?" Trump nodded, even though his friend couldn't see him. "Yes, I need to talk to someone who won't judge. I've been having a meeting with myself, and it seems like I'm just starting to understand what's going on. I need to figure out what I'm feeling." It was a turning point. Trump wasn't sure if he could fully open up and share his emotions, but he was certain of one thing. In order to keep moving forward, he had to look inside himself. One day, sitting in his office and reflecting on his conversation with Ed, Donald felt the weight of his father's memories pressing down on him again. Fred Trump had always been a man who couldn't stand weakness. He taught his son that respect could only be earned through hard work and achievement. But now, Donald realized that all these years, he had followed someone else's path, someone else's expectations, and had forgotten his own desires. One episode that forever stuck with him was during the summer days when he had just started rising in his career. His father, seeing him as a potential successor, brought him into his company. It was a time when Donald was only 22 years old, full of ambition and a desire to prove his worth. "You have to learn to be tough, Donald. The world doesn't wait. It's ready to crush you if you show any weakness," Fred had said, standing behind him in the office. These words sank deep into his soul, but essentially they were a threat. "You must be like me." Donald couldn't understand why his father was so sure that only through toughness could success be achieved. With each passing year, this toughness became a more pronounced part of his life. He worked to develop the same persistence as his father. But now, as he returned to his reality, he began to question, was my path the right one? Trump realized that in order to break free from the heavy shackles of his past, he needed to truly get to know himself. At this point, he began to look for ways to change his life, not just to achieve material success, but to find inner satisfaction. He found a new goal to travel the world and meet people he hadn't had time to connect with before. One of these journeys took him to Europe, where Trump met with prominent business people, politicians, and philosophers. These conversations became true revelations for him. One of these discussions was with a well-known German entrepreneur who explained to Trump how he had learned to let go of control and trust his team, instead of being the only one making all the decisions. "Donald, you understand that business is not just strategy and money. It's people, their ideas. You have to let others express themselves, not always be the one responsible for everything," the German said. These words struck a chord with Trump. He began to understand that in order to achieve truly great success, he needed to change his approach. Instead of simply dominating, he needed to be a mentor, a friend to his team, creating an atmosphere of trust and collaboration. Traveling, new acquaintances, and experiences became a revelation for Trump. He began to see life from a new perspective. He realized that success was not just about money and power. He understood that he needed to find harmony within himself to reach true satisfaction. However, the path to self-awareness wasn't easy. Donald Trump faced inner conflicts, doubts, and the very demons he had tried to forget. But now, He knew that in order to move forward, he needed to not only build buildings, but also build his soul. When he returned to New York, he was a different person. He no longer sought only external recognition. He was ready to open up to people and stop controlling everything and everyone. He had learned to trust. One day, sitting in his office, Trump looked at the photograph of his father that stood on his desk. Instead of feeling guilt and resentment, he felt gratitude. Everything that had happened in his life had led him to this moment. He realized that his father had been harsh with him, not because he didn't love him, but because he himself was tied to inner limitations and fears. In that moment, Trump decided that he was ready to forgive himself and his father for everything. He was ready to move forward and develop himself without relying on others' expectations. Now, he knew his path would be his own. Transformed on the inside, Donald Trump resumed his business and personal projects, but now with a different approach. He became more open to ideas, more trusting of those around him. He continued to succeed, but now his goal was not to prove his strength to everyone, but to be successful and happy with what he was doing. This inner growth became his true achievement. And now, looking at the future, he knew that the most important thing in life wasn't victories or defeats, but the ability to be honest with himself. Donald Trump was returning to New York after long weeks of traveling across Europe. Every conversation, every new acquaintance brought something important into his life. He began to reflect on the fact that he had remained stuck in a closed loop of familiar strategies and established behavior patterns. His view of the world was changing with each day, with every new interview, and with each conversation with people living completely different lives. One conversation, in particular, with an old friend Henry, a successful investment banker, stood out in his memory. Henry had always been straightforward and honest, never afraid to say what he thought. "Donald, you need to understand one thing," he said, sitting at a table in one of Manhattan's most prestigious restaurants. "Success doesn't come when you control everything around you, but when you know how to delegate. You always try to be the boss, but sometimes it's important to trust others. You don't do that." Trump thought about it. He wasn't used to trusting others. After years in business, he had become accustomed to the belief that no one but him could solve important issues. He had always been at the center of things, always had everything in his hands. But now, as he faced the reality of the changes inside himself, he realized that these words were not just suggestions, they were a vital revelation. "You know, Henry," Trump said, "I've been thinking my whole life has been built on control. I've always been sure that only through control could one achieve greatness. But now, it seems like I need to rethink everything. Maybe you're right." These words marked another step for Trump, in realizing that he needed to shed old habits, old ways. His task now was not only to manage, but to learn how to trust. Returning to his hometown was not the same as before. Although New York had always been his home now for Trump, the city had become a reflection of his own internal state, multifaceted, rich, and sometimes contradictory. He found himself surrounded once again by his business partners, colleagues, and friends. However, it all felt a bit foreign to him, as though he had become a spectator of his own life. At meetings, in conversations, in negotiations, he felt that he didn't always understand what was happening inside him. Often, he had to stop and ask himself questions that would not have even occurred to him before. He thought about his childhood, about how his father always demanded perfection, toughness, and resilience from him. He remembered the moments when his father compared him to other children, when he made him be better than everyone else. And now Trump began to understand that his father might not have wanted him to become just like Fred himself, but this view of himself had been deeply ingrained in him. Gradually, Trump began to notice that his old way of life, focused on competition and striving to be the best, was starting to affect his relationships with others. His close friends and employees began to notice that he had changed, more thoughtful, less confident, but at the same time, more humane and open. One such moment occurred during a meeting with his longtime friend and business partner, Michael. Michael had always been one of those who supported Trump and believed in his ideas, but recently they had rarely communicated on a personal level. "You've become someone different, Donald," said Michael when they were alone after an important meeting. "I don't know what happened, but you look like you're trying to solve an inner problem. It's okay, but you shouldn't forget who you are. You've always been the one who made the decisions. You need to return to yourself." Trump felt how these words touched him. Perhaps this was the true return to him's understanding that he didn't always have to be strong and invincible, that sometimes being vulnerable was necessary to grow. Over time, Trump began searching for ways to restore balance in his life. He started reading more books about philosophy, psychology, and personal growth. He realized that success wasn't just about money and power, it was about being honest with himself and others. He understood that the most important element of leadership was the ability to listen and understand people, not just to command them. One evening, sitting in his office and reflecting on his recent discoveries, Trump saw a photograph of his father. This was the moment when his life finally gained meaning. He was no longer trying to be perfect in the eyes of others. He understood that to achieve true success, he needed to learn to accept not only himself, but others as well. In that moment, Trump felt deep gratitude toward his father for teaching him to be strong and goal-oriented. But now he also realized that he needed to be thankful for the lessons time had taught him, lessons of humility, openness, and the ability to be honest. Trump continued his journey, but now it wasn't just a move forward, it was a conscious choice. He became more attentive to those around him, to those who worked with him. He no longer sought to be the center of attention, but began to value the opportunity to listen and teach others. He started to truly understand the people he worked with. His business continued to thrive, but now every project, every deal, was not just a way to make money, but an opportunity for growth and interaction. He learned to create teams where people could showcase their strengths, not just follow him. And one day, sitting in his office and reflecting on what had happened in his life, Donald Trump realized that he had finally found harmony between his personal and professional life. He no longer strived for the ideal because he understood that the ideal was the ability to be honest with oneself, to develop one's weaknesses, and to accept one's strengths. Trump realized that now he was ready to move forward with a new understanding of what matters most to be authentic.